There's a good chance I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for Android. It was a game-changing operating system for me back as a kid in high school. The fact that the whole thing was open source and I could just go in and look at and change the code, it was like the natural progression of HTML in the browser that you could edit the source of and see changes. It felt magical, like the things that powered my world were suddenly open to me, which is why I'm sad to say some of that magic is going away. The Android team is fundamentally changing the way they work on Android, and they're moving all development out of the open source projects. This has some concerning implications for Android, how it's being developed, and the long-term plans that Google has for this operating system. But since I'm not on Android anymore, I gotta pay that Apple tax somehow. So if I'm gonna make sure this bill for this phone gets paid, we need to take a quick sponsor break. Be right back. Today's sponsor is actually on topic for once. It's Infinite Red, the industry experts in React Native. And I'm not just saying that because they pay me to. I'm saying that because Jamin, the CTO and marketing expert, has been one of my good friends since way before I started all this YouTube stuff. There are a few people in the industry I trust as much as these guys. And when we finally make the T3 Chat mobile app, they're who I'm going to. React Native is no longer this weird, scary technology. It's the right way to build your apps. If you're not taking advantage of React Native, or at least deeply exploring it as an option, you are probably holding back what you could be building for your users. If you don't believe me, you should hit them up. And if you believe me and you want to figure out what this looks like, you should also hit them up. Instead of hiring up a whole team for iOS and Android and slowly getting caught up on features on each platform, maybe even just hire these guys. They'll build the code base that your web devs can contribute to. They'll get everything up to date as quickly as possible and give you a great app you can ship everywhere. You can take my word for it, or you can look at all of the other companies that they have worked with and found a ton of success building great mobile experiences. If you want to ship a great app, you should at least give these guys a call. You'll be surprised at what they can do. Check them out today at soydev.link/infinite. Google will develop the Android operating system fully in private. Here's why. Google does say they're still committed to releasing source code, so don't freak out just yet. But the way Google plans on operating the Android OS is very different from how it used to be. Currently, Google shares some of the work it does for the public AOSP Garrett, which I believe is the most recent version. Oh, Garrett's their code platform, I think. Yeah. There's a whole crazy history about Google's attempts to do GitHub alternatives. Google's code platform died a brutal death because no one liked it. They also refused to embrace Git until far too late. Painful that they're doing anything like this still. God. But yeah. The goal for the privatization is to simplify OS development and not to hinder external developers. So like Google remains committed to publishing source code to AOSP after each release. I think it'll help if you guys have a bit more history of where Android came from and how it got here. What better to do than Excalibur? We need to go back in time. All the way back to 2007, ideally a bit earlier. Our phones look like this. We think that we need these awful keyboards to get anything done on our devices. The operating systems that they are using are barely operating systems. They're a bunch of crappy Java applets. And the platforms across BlackBerry, Kyocera, and all the other phones that exist are entirely different and unrelated. It was a shit show, to be frank. And between companies like BlackBerry, Kyocera, what was the one fancy phone that was on T-Mobile? The Sidekick. There were so many of these different devices that had entirely different operating systems and tech stacks and methods to develop for them. And the emerging technology for developing for them ended up being this wonderful language known as Java. Java's whole selling point is that it was a way to write your code once, and as long as the runtime had been ported to different places, you'd be able to run that app in those other places. Okay, Nokia's a good point as well. I'll put that in the list. There's a lot of these. And Java had this big, bold promise of we can provide a single unified platform where you can write things and they will run on all these different devices. If you were trying to get into mobile development at the time and you went all in on these crappy proprietary Java applets, you were in for a rough time. They were not fun to write, and all the developers who went all in on that had to relearn everything once mobile apps as we know them now happened. But there were a couple things that needed to happen for this change to start occurring. The big thing was obviously the iPhone happened. For the iPhone, most touchscreens use a technology called resistive touch. The way it worked was there was a plastic layer on top of the screen that would be pushed in when you pushed, and the connection of the two layers was what triggered a touch. So you have your screen here, but you have the thing you touch in front, and when you touch the screen, what would happen is this would flex, and once it made contact with the screen, then it would trigger. But you'll feel, especially if you use like an old Nintendo DS or something, or one of those like stylus writers for signing your signature at a store after you use your credit card, stuff like that, you had to push down with force in order to make this connect. And that meant certain things were basically impossible. Dragging sucked unless you used a stylus. It could be precise, but not really. They just felt bad. This technology was bad enough that you basically had to use a stylus to do anything meaningful on this type of touchscreen. Apple went all in on capacitive touch instead. Capacitive touch was capacitive, which means it used the amount of electricity coming off of your skin to determine where your finger was on the device. That meant you couldn't use a traditional stylus on it because it wouldn't conduct electricity properly, but it meant they could do crazy things that weren't really fathomable before, like multi-touch with multiple fingers. For a while, the whole feature where you could just use fingers to zoom in like that, like I can on my trackpad here, where I just put two fingers and I can zoom in and out, that multi-touch gesture was patented by Apple because it was part of their genuine technological revolution with how we would interface with touchscreens. Capacitive was such a big change that they took the bold step of not putting a keyboard on the phone and having just a touchscreen, which at the time seemed insane, and all of the competition memed them endlessly and put keyboards on all their phones, even their fancy big touchscreens, they would have the slide-out keyboard, because it took us a decade to realize that these touchscreens were actually really good. It changed everything. And these capacitive touchscreens meant that all of a sudden, the platform we had all been building for, which was this crappy, tiny 4x3 screen with a keyboard underneath, was not the right way to build apps. But we had all these developers that knew Java. Now we need to go back a bit. Ignore everything I just said about iPhone and touchscreens, because in parallel to this era, there was a realization had around Java. The realization is that Java's platform, despite being universal, was not easy enough to distribute simply because BlackBerry, Kyocera, Sidekick, Nokia, and all these other companies had their own way of distributing things separately. So even if you had a bundle, you had built an app that could run on all these different phones, actually shipping it out was nearly impossible. And this led to a genius idea by the crew that eventually made Android called the Android Project. And the Android Project, believe it or not, was not intended to be an operating system initially. It was an app store and runtime. The goal of Android was to make it easier to build and distribute apps across all these different platforms. So the way they had things planned, Android would be an app you installed on a BlackBerry, on a Kyocera, on a Nokia, on whatever, and you would download apps built for Android, this Java layer, so you could build the Java app once and then put it on the Android store and sell it to all the users of all these different phones. Because at the time, the assumption was that we would have a Windows-like ecosystem, similar to how there are lots of different manufacturers making things with Windows, that we would get there with mobile. But since all the software was so different, the only path there was using Java instead. You might see where we're going with this. The Android project was doing okay at the time. They were excited to see where they could go building this platform for apps. But then the iPhone happened, kind of threw a wrench into those plans, because the iPhone happening meant that this platform is no longer anywhere near as viable. And on top of that, Google went into a full panic. Google was not prepared for the iPhone launch, and when they saw how well it did, they were terrified. This led to Google doing a bit of soul searching and hunting to try and figure out what project is far enough along that we can use it to actually meaningfully compete with what Apple is doing. Which is why Google bought Android. When Google bought Android, it was still very much this App Store platform project that was being built as an open source thing by, if I recall, a bunch of MIT kids. And Google acquired them and said, okay, we need an operating system now. And that is when they went all in on turning this platform they built into an operating system, which led to some interesting decisions. The most notable being Android was built in Java. Yeah. Java's a surprisingly powerful platform and language, and I'm known for defending it more than I probably should. Java gets way more crap than it deserves. A lot of that crap is deserved when you start building operating systems in it. And building Android in Java was a questionable decision. It was so questionable that eventually Google had to rebuild the entire Java runtime and platform to make Android run decently. Like, it's kind of insane the stuff Google had to do in order to unfuck what they had done by letting Android be an OS written in Java. Chat's already ahead here. There's a long-ass history of lawsuits between Google and Oracle. Oracle, who owns Java, felt that Google rewriting the Java standard was in violation of Oracle's patents and licenses, and they fought forever over this. And as much as I hate Oracle, and believe me, I am not an Oracle fan, especially the way that they've maintained the JavaScript trademark despite not shipping anything with JS, it should be illegal. But I actually think they had a fair point with the Android thing and with the recreation of Java and the JIT layer that Google had to build. That was copying other people's patented work. Yeah, it's a sketchy area. I'm happy that I'm not a lawyer because I would not have wanted to be involved in that case at all. But I do think Oracle had a legitimate argument, even if just because Google was using Java in a very unintended way and re-architecting it for free. Yeah. Android's whole history here is weird. It's also worth noting that Android from its start was always meant to be an open standard because they wanted to be the standard and they saw openness as a path there. So when it was acquired by Google, they maintained that openness. This resulted in a lot of different devices being made using Android. Going to kill this part because that didn't happen until much later. The first one was the G1. The G1 was the first official Android phone that was released by Google as a T-Mobile exclusive. If you're young enough, you might not recall this era. Most phones were carrier exclusives until Apple said, fuck this, and changed that. But for a very long time, phones only worked on one carrier. It's crazy to think now that that was the case, but it was, and it was insane. The G1 was a T-Mobile exclusive, and it was the introduction of Android. And what a phone it was. Again, the world wasn't bought into touchscreens yet, so despite having a decent capacitive screen, they stuffed a keyboard on it too. They also had a dedicated call and hang up button because it was that era. But this phone was one of the first open phones, which was cool to think that like the operating system on this device was open source, and it was the closest thing they had had to an iPhone competitor ever. Pretty nuts. Funny this says 2018 is when it was written because it was 2008. It took them over a year to get this out, but they did it. They had an iPhone competitor. And with this being successful, a lot of other companies took notice, specifically Verizon. Verizon was very jealous of the success of the iPhone on AT&T, and they wanted their own competitor, which is why Verizon spent way too much money to get the trademark for Droid. Because Lucasfilms, the creators of Star Wars, had the Droid trademark, so Android couldn't use the term Droid. Android was distinct enough they couldn't be sued for it, but Droid was a term that could not be used for Android because the trademark was owned by Lucasfilms and LucasArts. Verizon spent the money to pay that fee in order to do Droid phones, which ended up being the first super successful anti-Apple marketing campaign, and it normalized Android in a very meaningful way. My first smartphone was the original Motorola Droid on Verizon, and I had so much fun hacking the absolute hell out of that phone and its 600 megahertz processor. What a time. This also meant that we had a decent app store for the first time. But with that, we had another problem. The OS updates were not shipped by Google. Since my phone was made by Motorola, the operating system on my phone wasn't fully open source. It was a fork of Android that had a bunch of Motorola stuff added to it, a bunch of Verizon bloatware added to it, that was then locked in to my specific phone. When Google released an update to Android, it was up in the air if I would ever even see it. iPhones are known for getting updates for 6 to 8 years, sometimes more. At this point in time, Android phones would get updates for 6 to 8 months before they would stop getting major releases, which is insane, absolutely absurd. And when a new release came out, if you did get it, it would take months to get those updates. Over time, Google tried so many different things to fix this problem, to try and make it easier for Android users to get updates on their phones. They built this whole Android One program where manufacturers, to be certified, would have to promise to do updates within a certain time frame for a certain amount of time. Yeah, that went, let's be frank, that went poorly for them. No one wanted to do that. So Google ended up making a huge change to Android. Google moved all of the Google stuff out of Android Core. What this means is previously stuff like the Play Store, like the messaging app, like the notification services, those all used to be part of Android itself. Google ended up ripping out all of those things into their own separate Play Store services bundle that they could update separately. So even if your phone's on an old version of Android, changes they make to the store and the store architecture, to the notification services that developers use, to the Android platform beyond what features the OS has at its core, they were able to abstract a ton of the logic here. But at the same time, they also closed source all of that stuff. So a bunch of the things that were core to how Android worked and behaved suddenly were no longer part of Android itself. This had benefits and negatives. It meant that you could have a properly de-Googled Android by installing the open source project on a rooted phone and not installing the Google Play services bundle. Now, all of a sudden, you can have a properly de-Googled phone, but almost no apps are going to work because all of them expect to have those different integrations. This helped the fact that manufacturers suck, and it allowed for people to get updates, but it also was the start of this eroding of the open source goals of the Android project. There was also one more important change to Android. Around not this era, but soon after, I would say here-ish. If I recall, it was right around the same time the Droid happened. The Nexus line is introduced. The Nexus line was Google's attempt at raising the bar for Android phones. They felt as though the state of updates, the state of the hardware, the pricing, and all of these things were starting to get rough. So they made their own line of phones called the Google Nexus line that would be done in partnership with various manufacturers to make a good phone with guaranteed vanilla updates for a reasonable amount of time. I had a Nexus 4. I had a Galaxy Nexus. I also had both Nexus tablets, the 7-inch specifically. What a time. The Nexus line was historically very much a thing that diehard nerds like myself that were part of the open source experience would use, but they weren't devices that many beyond us lunatics would bother touching. They weren't marketed well. They weren't meant to be for consumers, but they were fine devices. Slowly, the Nexus line eroded. They made a big mistake by partnering with Huawei right before they got banned from the US, and that phone was an interesting device. They also, at some point around here, acquired Motorola. And the Motorola acquisition is one of the most legendary fumbles in the history of hardware, but also a sly play that benefited Google greatly. Google buys Motorola. Google bought Motorola for $12.5 billion, and then they sold Motorola to Lenovo for $2.91 billion. They took a nearly $10 billion hit in 2 years. They bought them in 2012 for $12.5 billion, and they sold in 2014 for $2.91 billion. There's one important piece that wasn't covered there in the buy and then immediate sell, which is Google kept the patents. Motorola is one of the first companies doing phones, had a bunch of crazy patents and prior art for all the things you'd ever need to do on a phone. We'll ask T3 chat. 17,000 patents when they were acquired. That's insane. That is genuinely absurd. So they kept the patents when they sold off Motorola and let the manufacturing and all of that stuff go over to Lenovo, who thought they would be able to make a play in phones and then failed. After this, the Pixel line is introduced. The Google Pixel line is like what we think of today when we think of Android phones, but it took them a few roles to get people to take them seriously. It was weird that Google was making a phone, similar to how weird it was when Microsoft started making the Surface line. It also was kind of a middle finger to the manufacturing partners, because the expectation at the time was that everyone else would make the phones, Google would just make the operating system, and Nexus was never a real threat. All of a sudden, Google's kind of throwing stones in their glass house. They're telling the manufacturers, hey, we're competing with you now. You're using ROS, and we're going to compete with you, which was terrifying for all these manufacturers. So there was a ton of infighting between them, attempts to make new app stores, the whole Amazon Fire shit show when they tried building their own Android platform, the Facebook phone. If you guys want a really good throwback, this has been entirely forgotten to time. Facebook tried building their own phone that was using an Android fork. Total shit show. Multiple attempts, too. Good times. Yeah. They had one that wasn't using Android and one that was, if I recall. But the Pixel line was a huge change because previously, the full OS on a Nexus, like all of the code running on your Nexus by default, was open sourced. As of the Pixel line, vanilla Android no longer meant open source Android. Your Pixel phone had a ton of software, a ton of features, a ton of things that were not part of Android. Google had very clearly diverged and was no longer just making Android this open platform. Android was an open platform for the OS, but the functionality and the key differentiators that made the phones great, everything from the camera app to the image processing layer to the notification systems to just how the accelerometer processed data, all of these pieces started to not be part of the open source Android builds. And more, you could have a brand new Google Android phone and a vanilla AOSP install next to each other, and they looked nothing alike. So over time, basically from acquisition on, Google has been slowly but surely de-opening the Android open source project. And to be clear, the OS itself is still open. It's based on Linux, kind of. They forked a long time ago. But Android, at this point in time, has significantly lost that open source vibe it was going for. There is one other important piece to consider. We'll ask T3 chat because it's always hard to find these numbers. How much money does Google make on the average iPhone user compared to the average Android user? Previously, when I found these numbers way back, Google would make about $1 a month per iPhone user and a bunch less, like 47 cents per Android user. So average spend is $12.77 per app on Android, $6.19 or on iOS, $6.19 per Android. Yeah, these numbers are hard to find now, but for a long time it was believed that Google made more money on iPhone users than Android users. There's a bunch of reasons for that, but the big one, as chat's correctly discovered, is the demographics. iPhone users on average have more money because iPhones on average cost more money. As such, it's not super surprising that Android users don't make as much money for Google because they're a worse target for ads. They have less money to spend. They're not buying services as often. It makes sense. I would bet that on average, iPhone users using YouTube have paid for premium significantly more often than Android users, like as a demographic. But I would also guess that the Pixel line is better there. And a big reason why they made the Pixels was to try and raise the bar for high-end Android phones to make them really competitive with iPhones again. They did a pretty good job. The Pixel line is so good that I've considered grabbing one. It's an iPhone lifer at this point. I really want the Pixel Fold. I'm not going to lie. I keep staring at it. I'm like, man, folding phones sound so good. And then chat's already spoiled the next part. Processors suck. Apple had started manufacturing their own chips, and the performance of those chips was insane. This is, to be fair, back in 2021, but this is from my friend / arch nemesis, the single guy who fights React the hardest. Here is the single core performance of different phones over time. So the Galaxy line had a big spike in 2017, and it is roughly maintained with a little bit of a bump here and there, whereas the iPhone, every single year, has a meaningful bump in its single core performance. The scariest thing here by far, though, is these cheaper Android phones. Despite the fact that a new $200 to $300 Android phone comes out every year, the performance does not actually improve. A $200 Android phone from 2017 doesn't perform that much worse than one from 2015, and doesn't perform that much worse than one from 2019. That sucks. The fact that the performance has not meaningfully improved on these phones for so long is genuinely terrifying. This made Google in particular very scared. The main reason this happened is a certain company that I really don't like, Qualcomm. Qualcomm is a very strange company because they don't really have to compete with anyone, because there aren't many companies making processors for phones that are even somewhat viable. And since you need their modems anyways, because they make the modems, the Wi-Fi chips, the CPU, the GPU, all the things you need to make a phone, they can kind of just charge whatever and update if and when they feel like at best. Every company that tried to compete eventually gave up. But Qualcomm was an interesting beast. And the rate of improvement in Android was very much tied to if Qualcomm felt like it. Because of this, Google was terrified because Apple was continuing to improve their chips with the iPhone, but they couldn't keep up because despite iPhones getting really good over time, Qualcomm just didn't care because their customers had to buy their processors anyways. Qualcomm had no incentive to compete with iPhone performance because Android phones weren't going to sell meaningfully better if they closed that gap. They could make just as much money selling the same chips forever. They don't care. Eventually, things got threatening enough that they started to adjust, but that took like 6 to 8 years for Qualcomm to even pretend to give a shit anymore. So Google introduces their own chip manufacturing. It took a while for Google's chip manufacturing to get good enough to be even talked about. They only put them in their cheap phones initially, and they were not as fast as competing Qualcomm chips. but slowly over time they got pretty good, and they went way further on the AI side for their own like infrastructure stuff. It's part of why Gemini is such a powerful model, because they're running on Google's own proprietary architecture. But it's also worth noting that Google's chips are very proprietary. We know very little about these chips. They run ARM, cool, but Google's kept the details here very tight-lipped. So to summarize all of this, Android is open except Play Services. Play Services is used for all of the core functionality in Android, from notifications to app updates to account management. Good luck using Android without Play Services. It's open except for the CPUs Google makes, which only Google can have access to. Google will let you use Android, but they won't let you use the chips they have. They won't let you use their camera app and processing. If you want to make an Android phone with a good camera, that's your problem. They're not going to share any of the work they have done there. Android's just slowly lost its open edge. Is it awesome that the OS itself is open? Yes. But at the same time, it is heartbreaking that so many of the core things you need to make a great Android phone are now fully locked down. According to chat, AOSP doesn't even have the phone app anymore. That's the point we're at. There was one tangent, and I don't know how far it's worth even going into this. Facetious. Google was planning a really bold fusion. They had two big operating systems. They had Android and they had Chrome OS. One of these was stable and one of these was based on Java. Their plan was to merge the two with a new OS that would allow for you to run Android apps and web native stuff within the same OS very trivially across all platforms. Sorry, it's Fuchsia. They spelt it weird. Don't blame me. I blame them. Blame Google for spelling their shit weird. This OS was meant to be the future of Google. The Google platform would coalesce onto Fuchsia as the OS for everything. I know it's supposed to be pronounced Fuchsia, or Fuchsia like the color. I don't care. They spelt it weird. They never released it. I don't give a fuck. This OS has had quite the development journey. They've accepted that it will never run on phones the way Android does. They've also seemingly divested from Android in a meaningful way where they just don't honestly seem to care as much about Android at all, which makes sense. They don't make a lot of money off of it, and it's not targeting the users trying to make the most money off of. This OS is still used, though, for Google Home. Your weird Google AI devices you can talk to are all this OS is used for. But it is using Rust, so if you want to feel good about that, yeah. I also think it's open source. I'm not sure. Haven't kept up because it's dead. It's rough. The open source history of Android is chaotic, and it seems like we have just entered a new chapter. So, sorry for that long tangent. Let's finish reading this. No matter the manufacturer, every Android phone has one thing in common: the software base. Manufacturers can heavily customize the look and feel of the Android OS that they are shipping on their Android devices, but under the hood, the core system functionality is derived from the same open source foundation, the AOSP. After over 16 years, Google's making big changes to how it develops the open source versions of Android in an effort to streamline its development. AOSP is an operating system that Google releases under the Apache 2 license. It means anyone can use, distribute, or modify and distribute the operating system based on AOSP without the need to pay a licensing fee or release source code. Progressive licensing structure has facilitated the widespread adoption of AOSP, leading to the creation of customized forks like Samsung's One UI, notably a closed source fork. There are cool open source ones like Graphene OS, which is a fully open source, privacy-focused Android fork. There's also Lineage OS, which is the end game for CyanogenMod, which was the community I got my open source journey really kickstarted in. Those are the open source ones by the community, though. All the ones by big companies like Samsung are closed source. Android does take contributions from third-party devs, but Google does do most of that development themselves. Internally, they treat Android as a full-scale product development operation internally in order to ensure the vitality of Android as a platform and as an open-source project. Therefore, Google has the final say in what code can be merged into AOSP and when new versions of source code are released. The company develops AOSP components privately to allow for devs and OEMs to use a single version of Android without tracking unfinished work from the future just to keep up. This is why I am concerned. Android has historically had a massive problem with how long it takes for manufacturers to ship the latest version of Android. When a new Android release comes out, if you're on One UI, Samsung now has to take all the things that changed in Android since when they forked and apply those changes to their fork. And they're probably going to want to do other changes around the same time too. That sucks. It's genuinely unpleasant. And now those developers can't even get ahead. They can't keep an eye on what is changing in order to make sure they are prepared with their own updates. This is something I do a lot. I track the changes in things like Next.js and things like React. If you go to the Next.js GitHub repo, you can almost always see what they are currently cooking. I was able to spoil pretty much their entire Next conference last year because I was reading the GitHub source, I was reading the changelogs, and saw that they had added a new feature I was excited about, did a video on it, and then it ended up being the main big thing they were going to announce at that conference. But here we could just go through and see all of the things that are being changed with every single Canary release. Pretty nuts. The point here being, if you're building a tool that's built heavily into or around Next or React, you can absolutely keep track of those changes. And I would hope that you have somebody who's full-time dedicated to managing that tooling around Next.js so they can keep an eye on these things and ask questions and make changes accordingly. Google just decided they don't want that anymore. This is kind of a hard stance they have taken where they are pulling away a lot of the benefits that non-Google Android phones have. There is one other really big layer here to go back to this history that I think will help clarify why they might be doing this right now. The Epic case. If you somehow aren't familiar because this video is on my other channel, Epic Games, the creators of Fortnite, have been in a very interesting set of legal battles with both Google and Apple regarding how they run their app stores. Both Google and Apple take a 30% cut of all digital transactions, either through purchasing an app on their app store or made in an app downloaded through their app store. IRL goods and services are not charged this fee. So if you book an Uber or buy a pizza or order something from Amazon, the percentage fee doesn't apply. But if you are buying an in-app purchase for something like a subscription to me on Twitch, or you're trying to support some creator on Patreon, or you want to buy a cosmetic in a game, a 30% cut goes to Google or Apple, depending on which platform you're on. Epic, rightfully, thinks that is fucking absurd because they refuse to let you do other options. It's not that I can't implement my own payment system. Stripe only takes 3%, but Google won't let me use Stripe unless I'm making an app that sells a physical good. This sucks. This sucks for so many reasons. And I genuinely look down on Google and Apple for doing this. As a fan of both and a hater of both, the way they run the app stores and the way they charge those fees is despicable, and it should be considered illegal. Google goes a step further, though. Google pays phone manufacturers to include Play Store, and more importantly, to not include other stores. Remember earlier when I mentioned the Amazon Fire ecosystem? Amazon actually had a phone too. And the Fire phone was one of the first and only attempts at a 3D screen on a phone, which was cheesy and terrible. But it also didn't have the Play Store. It only had the Amazon store. Google was terrified of this, so they started paying Android manufacturers to bundle Play Store and not other platforms. And since Play Store wasn't on the Fire phone and it was a big enough company that it could actually threaten Google, they were terrified. So they started working really, really hard to figure out how to make sure every Android phone ever always would have the Play Store. And what that ended up being is payments they would make to these manufacturers. So Samsung gets a huge check from Google in order to include the Play Store. And other companies get a bigger check if they also agree to not include competing stores. The landmark case that just happened is that this was decided to be illegal. In the court case with Epic, the court ruled that Google had such an absurd monopoly in the space that a couple things had to change. The entire Play Store catalog has to be accessible to competitors. That is a massive change in and of itself, because now every other app store is technically better than Google's, because other app stores have access to all of Google's apps as well as theoretically their own that aren't possible to download other places. They also now have to allow competing app stores to be installed through Play Store. So if I want to install the Epic Games Store or the Samsung Marketplace, Google has to let me put that on the App Store, which is insane. I never imagined we would be at the day where Google's forced to allow these things on their store. And most importantly, they have to stop paying manufacturers to bundle the Play Store and other Play services. It is worth noting that this ruling had a clear timeline on it of 5 years for these parts. But this bottom part here, the stop paying manufacturers, seem to be a pretty definitive, like forever type thing. The other two are temporary. In the words of the judge, the goal was to rebalance the monopolistic nature of how Google had behaved for a decade plus. The way the judge appeared to think of it was, if these two changes temporarily aren't enough for other stores to meaningfully compete with the Play Store, then it is a natural monopoly. Therefore, we shouldn't intervene. But if this monopoly only exists because of Google's bullshit, this will crush it. And now Android will once again be an open platform for at least app installs. This is an awesome ruling, and it's honestly sad to me that Google got screwed this hard and Apple barely got screwed at all, especially when you consider that Apple's effectively ignored the ruling and taken the interpretation that they have of it absurdly poorly. I could go on a long rant about that. Check out my videos on my other channel about how screwy Apple is with all of the stuff. They've been awful. Google historically has been just as awful, but the courts ruled in favor of Epic, which I did not expect, but that's a huge change. It means that a lot of the value Google gets from Android is at risk in a way it's never been at risk before. My honest guess is that this is one of the biggest motivators in the changes that we're talking about today. Google wants to minimize the amount of competitive advantages that non-Pixel phones have because they can no longer guarantee that non-Pixel phones have the Play Store. To balance AOSP's open nature with its product development strat, Google maintains two primary Android branches, the public AOSP branch and the internal development branch. The AOSP branch is accessible to anyone, while Google's internal branch is restricted to companies with a Google Mobile Services licensing agreement. Okay, so they are giving access to that internal branch still, perhaps? Previously, things like the Bluetooth stack were part of the public branch, but a lot of important components, the majority of them, including the core Android OS framework, was developed privately within the Google internal branch. Apparently, all development is moving to the internal branch now. The public branch often lags far behind what's available privately. And apparently, that private version is accessible to manufacturers, which means that the version of Android on your Samsung phone could be more up to date than what you can get from the open source build. Yeah, the latest Android 16 beta is from their internal branch, which is fundamentally different from the clean AOSP builds available right now. Fascinating. I had no idea that they had drifted that far. Apparently, the branches are different enough that merge conflicts arise, and since they're not using competent tools for source control management, that sucks. They have an example. Ooh, this is actually cool. They have an example patch here of like previous patch concern changing the number from 59 in the current patch. There's a hard-coded number for accessibility zooming, and they don't know what to change it to. That's terrifying. Android's new unlocked-only storage area API requires a Google engineer to cherry-pick a patch from the internal branch to AOSP to resolve merge conflicts. The API was developed in AOSP. The file containing the new Android flags was developed internally. This is awful. I wish they would just do all of it public, but yeah, this is a mess. One quick clarification, and phase sneak this in wherever it fits. Apparently, they're committing to quarterly platform releases. So every 3 months, there will be an updated open source build. That's much less bad than I initially thought. Still frustrating to not have any insight until that happens, but less bad than I initially thought. Another important piece is that with some of these open source forks like Graphene, there's a bunch of functionality that is just impossible for them to implement, like payment on touch. You can't do quick payments with Google Pay using Graphene because Google refuses to allow for fully open forks of Android to have access to some of these native APIs and systems because of concerns for hacking and whatnot. I remember back in the day when I jailbroke my iPhone and my bank app wouldn't let me in. Annoying fears. I get why they think they're doing it, but it says more about the insecurity of the platform and less about the intent of the developers when they do stuff like that. But it does suck for people trying to run an open Android device that a bunch of the functionality they expect from it just won't work because it's part of that Google private bundle that isn't being included in these much more privacy-focused forks. Google is still committed to publishing source code, so this doesn't mean that they're going closed source, but it does mean we don't know when we will see the open source builds when we install things on our phone. And despite the previous era where a Nexus phone was running code that you could go build and install yourself, Android has moved far in the other direction over time, and you cannot see the code that is running on your Pixel phone today. Other notable thing is that if they make kernel changes, they have to keep publishing those basically as soon as they build and ship them, because that's licensed under GPL, which is a license that very clearly states that changes to the code have to be open sourced as well. So the Android Linux kernel is going to still be fully open source because it has to be. But the rest of Android, they're going to do whatever the hell they want with by the seams of it. And this all starts next week. It's also worth noting that this doesn't immediately change anything for the community. App devs will be unaffected. People building custom ROMs won't be more affected than they already were by the slow divergence of these different branches. If you're trying to build Graphene OS on the latest Android, your timelines have been crunched over time because Google gives you less and less of the code up until release. Also of note is that most companies that fork AOSP rarely use the main AOSP branch because of the instability of it. Yeah. And this is why I'm covering it. External devs who enjoy reading or contributing to AOSP are likely going to be dismayed by the news because it's meaningfully reducing our insight into what the hell Google is doing. If I don't have this fancy GMS license, I can't see what's going on in Android anymore. Apparently, somebody found the Pixel webcam feature months before it was officially released, which allows for much higher quality use of your phone as a webcam device by plugging it in over USB. That was found in the Android source code, which allowed somebody to leak it. Those types of things are over now. Google had 3 options: maintain the status quo, shift all development internally, or make all development public. Considering Google's stated rationale for private Android development and its recent transition to trunk-based development, its decision to consolidate work under a single internal branch, streamlining both OS development and source code releases, is understandable. Yeah, waiting for Google to say more, but for now, this is some sad news. As a person who largely got into open source as a result of Android being an open platform, it's sad to see more and more of these things get shut down. I'm scared of a world in the future where kids don't have access to the things they need to play with the stuff that they are doing. The fact that Flash isn't a viable way for people to make games anymore. The fact that we experience software through apps instead of websites where I can right-click, inspect, and make changes. Like, it's silly, but doing stupid shit like this when I was a kid is a huge part of how I got into software. The fact that I could just edit the page and make funny things said on it made this all feel accessible and real to me in a way that it didn't before. It no longer was a portal to a world I didn't understand. It's just code that I can adjust and change. And I'm scared that the kids of tomorrow aren't going to see the world the same way because the screen only goes in one direction for them. They don't have the ability to peer through and see the code underneath anymore. And as we move away from computers and browsers to phones and apps, and we move away from open platforms to closed ones, I'm scared that the next Theo might not get the kickstart that he would have when I got started myself. So that's how I feel. Android doesn't make enough money or bring enough value for Google to do these weird things, but it's also why they are, because they want to minimize the cost of dealing with it all in the first place. So with all of that said, I'm sad, but I'm curious how you guys feel. Am I overreacting, or is this a pretty big deal? Let me know what you guys think. And until next time, keep hacking.